Welcome. Today we are travelling to Kyneton Cemetery in the Macedon Ranges to visit the final resting place of Alan McAnally, an Irish convict who was transported to Australia in 1841. Now there is some confusion in the records about her age at the time of transportation. She may have been as young as 9 years old. But her convict conduct record on arrival in Vandemonians land recorded her as 17. Now, Alan was born in County Fermanagh in Ireland. In March 1841, young Alan was charged with vagrancy. Vagrancy was a common accusation levelled against the impoverished during that era. Vagrancy laws were harsh and often used to criminalise poverty, especially among those who lacked stable housing or employment. For young women like Ellen, simply being found in public without visible means of support could be enough to warrant arrest. These laws reflected the rigid social expectations of the time, where women were expected to be under the protection of family or in service, domestic service, and any deviation from that norm was viewed with suspicion. Now, this is the lovely Kyneton Cemetery. It had a real kind of British-Irish feel to it. Kyneton has quite a cool climate, so there was a lot of mossy graves, and I really liked it. So the charge of vagrancy was commonly levelled against women who were homeless, begging, or suspected of engaging in informal or illicit work, including prostitution. Ellen's conviction was likely a consequence of economic hardship, as Ireland was already contending with widespread poverty and displacement even prior to the onset of the Great Famine. An article in the Newry Telegraph reported the incident on the 16th of March. Alan McAnally indicted for vagrancy. James Carson, who had observed Alan over the previous 6 months, described her as a person of idle and disorderly habits, with no fixed residence and a reputation of ill fame. He testified that she had repeatedly damaged public property and had spent time in confinement. Carson also noted that Alan appeared to have no friends or support network, though it was mentioned to the court that she could potentially return to her mother, who lived near Monaghan. Well, Mr. James Carson, why didn't you help her? Interesting. The court found Alan guilty and issued a conditional sentence. She was fined for the present and told she would be discharged if, within 3 months, she could provide security for her future good behaviour, £5 from herself and 2 sureties of £25 each. Failing that, she would be transported for 7 years. This moment marked a turning point in Ellen's life, as she became one of the many young Irish women swept up in a system that punished poverty with exile. Alan already had a string of prior convictions, 8 or 10 for vagrancy, and had served 6 months in jail for theft. Her record also noted that she'd been on the town for 12 months. In 19th century Ireland, this phrase was an indirect way of describing a young woman's involvement in prostitution or a lifestyle considered morally improper. Though not a formal legal term, on the town appeared frequently in convict records and court documents. It typically referred to women who were living without a fixed address and surviving through street-based means, which, unfortunately, often included sex work. After the 3 months was up, Alan was likely put into Armagh jail to await her 7 years transportation. By June, she would have been on her way down to Dublin to be transferred to the transportation ship the Mexborough. And now that's the same ship as Anne Ward, and you can watch Anne's story on my video titled A Wretched Death, the tragic story of Irish teen convict Anne Ward. And I'll put a link in the description of this video if you are interested in watching Anne's story. I will also put a link to Brian Risso's article about the voyage of the Mexborough in the description below. Now, Ellen was described as 5 foot 2.5 inches, fair with brown hair, hazel eyes, and as you can see, AI just cannot do hazel eyes, so for this video, Ellen's got brown eyes. Anyway, and according to the recorder, she was much freckled. But no doubt months on a ship in the southern hemisphere without sunscreen will do that to lovely Irish skin. The Mexborough sailed into the Derwent River on the 26th of December. According to research by Brian Risso, the ship's doctor, Dr. Hampton, reported to authorities that apart from 2 fatal cases, all those on board had arrived in better health than when they embarked. Ellen received a favourable report from the ship's surgeon, noting her well-behaved conduct during the voyage. Risso writes, within just over 2 weeks of their arrival, 68 women had been assigned out from Hobart town. Meanwhile, 57 women, including Ellen, were placed aboard the government brig the Isabella for assignment in the Launceston district. Ellen's first assignment was to a Mr. Collins. And in February of 1842, she appeared before the Evandale Lower Court, where Mr. Collins requested that she be returned to the service of the government. Clearly things were not going well. By June 1842, Ellen had been assigned to the Smith family, where she was accused of being absent without leave and subsequently sentenced to 7 days of solitary confinement at the Launceston Female Factory. A year later, Ellen was assigned to the Hewson family. She was again found absent without leave and sentenced to a period of 6 days in solitary confinement at the Launceston Female Factory. Her next assignment was to the Crampton family, and records indicate that she was subsequently charged with absconding, though the circumstances surrounding the charge are not detailed, and as a result 6 months were added to her original transportation sentence of 7 years, and Ellen was also detained on probation for 2 months. A probation period was intended to reform female convicts through religious instruction, domestic training and strict discipline. Held at the overcrowded Launceston Female Factory, she would have endured harsh conditions while being prepared for future assignment as a domestic servant. And I think the look on her face there sums up exactly how she feels about that. After completing her probationary period, Ellen was assigned to a Mrs. Martin, and once again Ellen absconded. It's clear she disliked working as a domestic servant, and who could blame her? As a consequence, a further 6 months were added to her original 7-year transportation, bringing the total to 8 years. Interestingly, rather than being returned to the female factory, Ellen received an extension to her sentence. And now this raises a possibility that the factory may have been overcrowded and that authorities were opting to increase sentences instead of sending women back to jail. And if you have any insights into this, please feel free to leave a comment below. In September, Ellen was reassigned once more, and this time to the Mimets. The Mimets, I haven't heard that surname before, have you? Unusual. And she was again found to be absent without leave. As punishment, she was returned to the Launceston Female Factory this time, where she served 14 days in solitary confinement. Solitary confinement at the Launceston Female Factory in 1843 was a grim and punishing experience. The cells used for isolation were small, dark and sparsely furnished, often with little more than a wooden bench or a straw mattress. Light and ventilation were minimal, and the convict would be cut off entirely from the rest of the prison population for the duration of her punishment. In Alan's case, this time around, 14 days. She would have endured complete silence, with no work, no conversation, and no distraction. The psychological toll of such isolation was severe, especially in an environment already marked by overcrowding and hardship. During solitary confinement, the convict's diet was typically reduced to bread and water, a common disciplinary measure at the time. The intention was not only to punish but to break the spirit and enforce obedience. For women like Alan, who repeatedly resisted the harsh expectations of domestic servitude and penal discipline, solitary confinement was both a consequence of defiance and a reflection of the punishing culture of that era. Things calmed down for a few months after Alan's bout in solitary, but in April 1844, Alan was ordered to serve a further probation back at the Female Factory in second class. Women placed in second class were typically those who had completed their initial processing or punishment, but were not yet considered trustworthy or well-behaved enough for first class or assignment. Alan was definitely not happy being assigned out to private families. And look, there may have been a lot of other things going on, we just don't know. During this probationary phase, second-class inmates were subjected to strict discipline and limited privileges. They were often engaged in laundry work, sewing, spinning, or other factory labour, which was physically demanding and monotonous. Their movements were closely monitored, and they were housed separately from first-class women who were awaiting or already assigned to private service. Second-class women had fewer opportunities for interaction, recreation, or religious participation compared to those in higher classes. The probation system aimed to encourage good behaviour through a tiered structure. Advancement to first class depended on compliance, work ethic, and moral conduct. However, overcrowding at the factory with over 250 women, housed in a space designed for about 80 to 100, made it difficult to maintain clear separation between the classes. This often led to tensions, outbreaks of insubordination, and delays in progression through the system. 6 months later, Ellen had been demoted to third class, indicating that she was not behaving. Those relegated to third class were considered the most unruly or morally compromised, often repeat offenders or women who had defied the strict codes of behaviour imposed by the colonial penal system. Life in third class was harsh and unforgiving. These women were stripped of privileges, confined to the most austere quarters, and subjected to constant surveillance. The factory's design allowed the superintendent to observe all areas, ensuring that discipline was maintained and that the so-called flash mob, a term used for rebellious inmates, could be swiftly dealt with. And you can learn more about the flash mob by watching the story of Alan Scott at the link below in the description. Daily life for third-class inmates was marked by monotony, deprivation, and punishment. They were denied access to the factory's better work assignments and were often confined to menial or punitive labour, such as washing or sewing under strict supervision. Religious instruction was compulsory, though the women were segregated during services to prevent the contamination of more reformable inmates. Oh dear. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and limited rations added to their suffering. For many, third class was not just a punishment, it was a liminal space between hope and hopelessness, where survival depended on submission or resistance. Perhaps third class finally persuaded Alan to start cooperating, or perhaps the factory simply wanted to be rid of her, because in November she was granted her ticket of leave. A ticket of leave marked a significant shift in her status. It was not a full pardon, but rather a conditional form of freedom granted by the colonial authorities. Women who earned this privilege were allowed to live and work within a designated district, often under the supervision of local magistrates. They could seek employment, earn wages, and even rent accommodation. But they remained under strict surveillance and were required to report to authorities on a regular basis. Any breach of the conditions, such as leaving the district without permission or engaging in misconduct, could result in the ticket being revoked and the woman returned to penal servitude. The ticket of leave system was designed to encourage good behaviour and gradual reintegration into colonial society. For many women, it offered a chance to escape the harsh conditions of the female factory and begin rebuilding their lives. Ticket holders were still considered convicts, and their movements and associations were closely monitored. Despite these restrictions, the ticket was seen as a lifeline, a step towards eventual emancipation, and for some, the possibility of a conditional pardon and, eventually, full freedom. A bit of freedom must have suited Ellen, because she lasted 2 years before being in trouble again, and this time for misconduct, although unfortunately the misconduct was not recorded. She was sent back to the factory for 14 days of hard labour, a physically demanding and psychologically punishing experience. The exact nature of the work was often left to the discretion of the factory overseers. But of course, as we've said before, common tasks would have been laundry work, wash tub, where women washed linen for institutions such as the hospital, the military barracks and the orphan schools. The work was gruelling. It involved long hours of scrubbing, wringing and hauling water, and often in cold and unsanitary conditions. It was tough. Other forms of hard labour included picking oakum, a tedious and painful task that involved unravelling old, tarred ropes to produce fibres using for ship caulking. Women might also be assigned to carding and spinning wool or horsehair, which was considered particularly strenuous. These tasks were performed under strict supervision, and failure to meet quotas could result in further punishment, such as solitary confinement or a diet of bread and water. The women were typically confined to specific yards or cells depending on the severity of their sentence, and those in the crime class were subjected to the harshest conditions. For Alan, 14 days of hard labour would have been a punishing reminder of the consequences of defiance within a system designed to break the will of its inmates. Now, fortunately for Alan, this was her last misdemeanour under the convict system. On the 11th of March 1848, Ellen gave birth to her first child, a daughter she named Ellen. The father was fellow convict John Barfoot, who has a fascinating convict story and family history. John was a son of convicts and was born in Sydney in 1817, and I believe he was tried for horse flogging in Hobart town in 1837 and received a life sentence. So I'll be sharing his story in my next video. It's really fascinating. So be sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss it. Baby Ellen's birth certificate lists her parents as Ellen and John Barfoot, although the couple didn't marry until 2 months later. Their wedding took place at St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Launceston on the 29th of May. and at the time John was 35 years old and Ellen was 23. John had already received his certificate of freedom and was listed as a labourer on the birth certificate. 6 months later, Ellen was granted a conditional pardon. A year later, on the 9th of April 1849, Ellen was given her certificate of freedom, which represented a significant milestone. It marked the formal end of her sentence and restored many of the civil rights that had been stripped away upon conviction. With the certificate, she was no longer under government control, free to choose her own employment, residence and associations. Ellen and John must have been planning to move to Victoria as soon as she received her freedom, because only 10 days later, Ellen, John and baby Ellen boarded the Shamrock from Launceston to Melbourne. Gold had yet to be found in Victoria, but it was a young and rapidly developing colony, offering the promise of employment, land, and a chance to escape the social stigma attached to their convict past. The family made their way to the Geelong region, and in October 1850, Ellen gave birth to another daughter, Mary Jane, in a place known as Barrabool Hills. The area was renowned for its fertile soil and was well suited to farming, particularly wheat cultivation and sheep grazing, which drew settlers hoping to build a stable livelihood. I believe John was eager to establish himself as a farmer in Victoria, and Barrabool Hills offered an ideal opportunity to do just that. Three years later, Ellen gave birth to a son they named John, after his father and grandfather. The excitement of the gold rush must have captured the Barfoot's imagination, just like the rest of the world, because just 2 years later, the family had relocated to Ballarat. There is an interesting article in the Ballarat Star on the 4th of May 1857. An inquest was held before the district coroner, Dr. Glendinning, into the death of an unnamed Chinese digger who had passed away at Eureka. The newspaper described him as evidently a new chum, and the term new chum was a colloquial expression used to describe a recent immigrant, particularly one who was inexperienced or unfamiliar with the harsh realities of colonial life, especially on the goldfields. The article continued. It appeared that deceased had been ailing for some time and was, we believe, turned out of the Chinese encampment. John Barfoot and family had for the last few days supplied him with food, which he usually ate ravenously, and also took him into their tent to sleep from charity. On Saturday night, the deceased groaned a good deal, and before sunrise in the morning of Sunday was found dead. The post-mortem examination showed the immediate cause of death was dysentery, accelerated by want and the present severe weather. There was an enormously enlarged liver and also disease of the heart. Verdict in accordance with the above facts as being one of those cases of desertion of their sick countrymen by the Chinese, and the chief of the village, Lintak, being unable to furnish any explanation of the circumstances attending the expulsion of the deceased from their camp. We think the matter deserves the most searching inquiry and censure or punishment where such may appear to be merited. We learn with satisfaction that Dr. Glendinning intends reporting all the circumstances to the Chinese protector. How kind it was of the Barfoot family to care for the man, especially considering they may have been struggling financially themselves or fearful of disease. Their actions offer a touching insight into their true character. I had never heard of the Chinese custom of deserting their sick on the goldfields, and researching the matter proved challenging. Much of the information I came across dismissed the idea, suggesting it was a racist stereotype. However, we have an historical document that clearly shows this situation did occur. So with a bit of help from AI, I was finally able to uncover the following information. Chinese camps were not monolithic. They were made up of people from different dialect groups and regions of China. If a miner was not part of the same clan or village network, he might not have received the same level of care. This could explain isolated cases of neglect, especially if the group was under pressure to move or facing external threats. This might explain the man being left to die and the fact that no one knew his name. In the harsh and often chaotic environment of the Ballarat goldfields during the 1850s, it was not uncommon for individuals, regardless of background, to fall through the cracks of communal care. While Chinese mining groups were generally known for their strong internal support systems, including shared labour, traditional medicine and clan-based cooperation, there were exceptions. A Chinese man being deserted by his camp may have been the result of several overlapping factors. He could have been gravely ill with a contagious disease, isolated from his dialect group, or simply unable to keep up with a mobile party under pressure to relocate. And he could have been a really bad man, we don't know. The arduous journey many Chinese migrants undertook, such as the 500-kilometre trek from Rhodes to Ballarat, left many physically weakened and vulnerable to illness. In such cases, practical survival often took precedence over compassion, especially when resources were scarce. Additionally, the Chinese protectorate system, while intended to manage and support Chinese communities, was inconsistently applied and often under-resourced. Cultural misunderstandings and racial segregation further complicated matters. European observers unfamiliar with Chinese customs around illness and death may have interpreted actions like leaving a dying man in a quiet place as abandonment, when they may have been following traditional beliefs about death and the afterlife. However, in this particular case, the fact that a European family stepped in to care for the man before he died suggests a moment of cross-cultural empathy that defied the broader tensions of the time. It also reflects the reality that despite systematic racism, individual acts of kindness and humanity did occur on the goldfields. If you have any more information about this, please let us know in the comments. The Barfoots made their way to the Mount Alexander diggings sometime after this event. There are no more records or information about them until the inquest into Alan's death in 1860. The family had travelled to Kyneton to visit relatives, and it was there that Alan tragically passed away. Through the inquest, we gained valuable insight into her life and her health. And rather than summarise, I think it's best to read the witness statements directly so you can fully understand what was happening in Alan's life at the time. Alan's inquest was held at Kyneton on the 9th of June 1860, the day after her passing. The first witness was Matthew Keefe, superintendent of the Kyneton Hospital, and he said, "Yesterday at about 4:30, as I was going to Carlshrue and when about a quarter of a mile beyond the Shamrock Hotel, I met a little boy." This was probably young John. He would have been about 7 years old at that time, who was crying. I asked what was the matter, and he said his mother was smothered in the cart and his father was gone to get a horse to bring her back. I went with the boy to the dray and saw a woman's feet hanging out of the front part of the dray. I looked in and I saw the deceased lying on her left side and her head and shoulders in a tub. Her mouth was downward. The woman was dead. I did not see any marks of violence about her, but blood was brimming from the mouth. Her body was half in the tub and the head was hanging down. The height of the tub was about 2 feet and I did not see anything in it. I then went and gave information to the police. There were 2 children in the cart, one about 4 years old and the other about 6 years old. There was very little blood. I think from the position of the body, she might have fallen into the tub. I recognised the deceased as a woman I had seen the morning before yesterday at the hospital of Kyneton. She there appeared to be under the influence of liquor. The face was black. The second witness was a farmer named James Hockey. James was an emancipated convict from Shepton Mallet in Somerset. He had been transported in 1830 for horse theft. He testified that he had seen the body of the deceased and that he recognised it as Ellen Barfoot. She was my sister-in-law. The deceased and her husband came to my house on Monday last and remained till yesterday morning. She appeared in perfectly sound health when she came. She was not sober. And she continued to drink brandy and ale while she remained. She was seldom sober. She slept in her dray every night, with the exception of the night when she remained in my house on Thursday night. I came home about 10:30 o'clock and found the deceased lying on the floor in front of the fire. And a bottle was on the table with brandy in it. She was quite drunk and had to be lifted up, and her husband carried her to the dray. I did not hear or see anything of her until yesterday morning about 9 o'clock. When I saw her and her husband standing by the side of the dray, they were just going away. She appeared to be under the influence of liquor. Then they went a short time after that. I lent them my horse to go as far as Newtown and went with them myself. And I then wished them goodbye and went to the dray and spoke to the deceased. She merely answered by a grunt. I saw her and she was sitting in a tub. Her head was leaning back. She appeared to be asleep. On Thursday, I saw the deceased fall on some stones. I think her head struck the ground, and she did not complain of being hurt. I did not supply her with the drink. She fetched it herself. I have known her more than 12 years, and she has always had good health, but always drank a great deal. I never heard deceased and her husband quarrelling. The third witness was a medical doctor named Thomas Law McMillan, who conducted the autopsy. His testimony is as follows. I am a legally qualified medical practitioner residing in Kyneton. I have examined the body of the deceased. The surface of the body was generally pale and there was an unusual amount of post-mortem lividity. Now, post-mortem lividity refers to the purplish discoloration that occurs due to the gravitational pooling of blood after death. It can provide critical insights into the time and circumstances surrounding death. An atypical amount or distribution of lividity may suggest a prolonged post-mortem interval, environmental influences, or even repositioning of the body, each of which can significantly affect the course of an investigation. The doctor continued. The facial features were not distorted and there was no sign of violence except for a small knot of ecchymosis, apologise, I'm not sure how to say that, under the chin. So ecchymosis or ecchymosis, it's getting worse, is the medical term for a bruise. Should just say bruise. So she had a small bruise under the chin. And Dr. McMillan went on to describe the post-mortem findings in more detail. Notably, the right side of the heart was flaccid and empty. While the technical specifics are extensive, one particularly interesting observation was that the stomach and intestines were completely empty. According to forensic standards, this typically suggests the person had not eaten for at least 6 to 8 hours prior to death and possibly longer. Another significant finding was that the liver was approximately twice its normal size, indicating very poor health. If the deceased was not eating due to alcoholism, it strongly suggests she was in a severely compromised state. And it raises the troubling question, who was caring for the children? Dr. McMillan concluded his findings with a sombre assessment. I attribute death to asphyxia, which may have been produced by drowning or might have been caused by other means. I believe it could have resulted from the head hanging down with the face near the ground. I have no reason to suppose there was any violence. Smothering would produce the appearance I have described. The implications of this are deeply unsettling. Whether through drowning, positional asphyxia, or smothering, the death was slow, silent, and profoundly distressing. Combined with the signs of poor health, malnutrition, and the absence of recent food intake, it paints a picture of a person in severe decline, physically, emotionally, and socially. The circumstances surrounding her final moments suggest not only suffering, but isolation. It was a heartbreaking end for poor Alan. The fourth and final witness was Alan's husband, John Barfoot. Under oath, he gave the following testimony. I am a miner and reside at Mailwood. The word Castlemaine was crossed out in the original record, suggesting the family may have lived somewhere near the gold diggings in the Castlemaine district, which, well, we know they did. However, I could find no reference to any town or locality named Mailwood. So if you have any further information about this place, or it may have even just been a small digging, please feel free to share it in the comments below. So John goes on. Deceased was my wife. Her name was Alan Barfoot and her age was 28. Now I'm going to pause it here because according to Alan's convict records, she was listed as 17 years old upon arrival in Van Diemen's Land in 1841, which would place her birth year around 1824. Yet here in 1860, her husband states that she was 28, suggesting a birth year closer to 1832. This discrepancy raises questions. Did Alan genuinely not know her age, which is quite possible, or was she perhaps much younger, possibly as young as 9 when she arrived, rather than 17 as recorded? You would think her husband would know her exact age if Alan knew it, but it's difficult to say with certainty. But it is a reminder of how fluid and uncertain personal details could be in the colonial era, especially for women with convict backgrounds. So John continues, we came to Kyneton on Monday last to Mr. Hockey and remained there till yesterday. My wife was drinking a great deal at the time, chiefly brandy and ale. She was drunk nearly all the time. I lifted her into the dray yesterday morning. She sat on some bundles which were in the tub. I then started on the road, and in about 4 or 5 hours I stopped on the road to get dinner when my 7-year-old son said to me, Mother's dead. I went to the cart and found her with her head hanging down in the tub and her face touching the bottom. A bag of chaff wheat had slipped from its place and partly covered the tub, but did not press on her. I lifted her up and she was quite dead, and the face was dark and swollen. I directly went and gave information to the police. When we left Hockey's, my wife was drunk, but capable of taking care of herself. Was she? I beg to differ, but anyway. I did not know she took any drink with her, but I did find a bottle containing brandy in the dray. The children told me she drank some on the road. My wife fell while at Hockey's, but did not complain of being hurt. She may have been drunk, so she might not have felt it too, which is a problem. So dear me, this is a lot to unpack, isn't it? The fall on the stones could possibly explain the bruise on her chin, but my concern is for the children. Were they in the dray with their mother as she lay dying, suffocating? And then they had to sit there for hours after she had passed. How traumatic. It's surprising to me that if Alan was an alcoholic and had been for years, John hadn't had her committed to an asylum. It would seem he truly loved her. In colonial Victoria during the 1860s, it was disturbingly common for husbands to have their wives committed to asylums, particularly if they were struggling with alcoholism. At the time, excessive drinking in women wasn't simply seen as a health issue, it was often labelled as a form of moral insanity or intemperance. conditions that fell under the broad and loosely defined umbrella of mental illness. Committing an alcoholic wife to an asylum could also free up the husband to be able to remarry or form a relationship with another woman, someone who might help care for the children. The 12 jurymen found that Alan died on the 8th of June 1860 near Kyneton, and that her death was caused by asphyxia while she was in a state of intoxication. The jury were also satisfied that Alan's death resulted from accidental causes. It's interesting to observe how swiftly deaths were investigated in those days. With no forensics or lengthy inquiries, verdicts were typically delivered on the same day, or, as in Alan's case, the day after the death was recorded. One can't help but wonder how many people may have gotten away with murder, particularly in domestic situations. Because of the findings, there were no newspaper write-ups or sensational headlines about Alan's death, or none that I've been able to find at least. Janet McCalman, in her book Vandemonians, offers some insight into what the Barfoots were doing in Kyneton at the time, along with some concerning details about the family's background. So in her book Vandemonians, on page 172, she writes, "A third woman who came to a grim end was Alan McAnally, a shipmate of the wretched Anne Ward, who died in a hut at Back Creek. In 1860, she travelled with her husband John and 3 young children to visit his sister in Kyneton. His sister Anne was not a convict. Alan drank day and night, brandy complemented by beer, until she died by asphyxiation when her head fell into a bucket of water on the family dray. She was just 28. Well, pause here. From reading the inquest notes, we know that Alan didn't drown, but was smothered, probably by the bottom of a portable bathtub or the bags of wheat stored there, because she was too drunk to lift her head up. Her age is also debatable, as we have already discussed." McCalman continues, "The Barfoot's hosts in Kyneton were James Hockey and Anne Barfoot, who seem to have followed..." Now, McCalman writes, "Anne seems to have followed her brother to Van Diemen's Land when he was transported from Sydney. But from further research, I found out that Anne was actually born in Tasmania in 1821, and I will go into more detail about the fascinating Barfoot family in my next video, so subscribe so you don't miss it." Hockey had a strong personality and fingers in many pies. The couple had 7 children and had come to Portland Bay in 1847. Hockey set up as a butcher in Melbourne, where he and Anne socialised among the Little Burke Street Vandemonians. In 1850, he was a splitter at Macedon when his wife tried to run off with another man. Again, I will go into this in my next video. Hockey was another violent husband, and by 1860, the two were living apart in Kyneton, where he called himself a farmer. He was speculating in land, having perhaps made money on the goldfields, but his daughters and his wife were associated with a low house in Baynton Street, run by a Mrs. Clark. And the police were taking a keen interest in everything James did. By December 1860, they had got him on a charge of vagrancy. This is associated with convicted thieves such as the bushrangers and fellow Vandemonians Samuel Cherry and Benjamin Long. One witness testified that Hockey's house was a nursery of crime in the district, and that every prisoner leaving Pentridge knew to call in there. James Hockey was sentenced to 12 months on the roads and never returned to Kyneton. So what happened to John and the children after Alan's death? I'll be sharing more about John's story, as I've said, in my next video. But in the days following Alan's passing, John was charged with being drunk and disorderly in Kyneton and spent 3 days in prison. And I believe his sister Anne and her daughters were able to care for Alan and John's children during that difficult time. Alan McAnally's death was as tragic as her life was difficult. The inquest into her passing reveals a woman in deep physical and emotional decline, struggling with alcoholism, likely malnourished, and ultimately dying in a state of intoxication. The image is haunting. That her 7-year-old son was the one to alert others to her death is heartbreaking beyond words. The jury found her death accidental, and with no sensational headlines or public scandal, Alan slipped quietly into the historical records. But Alan's life was never quiet. From her early days in Ireland, where poverty and social stigma led her to conviction for vagrancy, to her transportation to Van Diemen's Land as a teenager, perhaps as young as 9, she endured a penal system that punished the poor and marginalised. Her years in the Launceston Female Factory were marked by resistance, punishment and survival. She refused to conform, and in doing so revealed a tough spirit. Ellen McAnally was more than a convict. She was a daughter, a wife, a mother and a woman who lived through extraordinary hardship. Her story is not one of triumph in the traditional sense, but of survival against the odds. In remembering her, we honour not only her life, but the lives of countless women like her, forgotten by history, but not by those who choose to look more closely. May she be remembered with compassion. May her story continue to be told as part of our extraordinary convict history.